Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really happy to have with me for the first time David Haggith. David started writing about the economy after he predicted the Great Recession half a year before it hit, and was puzzled as to why no economist or stock analyst saw it coming. In the months after the crisis broke out, he started to write humorous editorials in a series called Downtime, which chided the U.S. government and banking people who should have seen the economic collapse coming, but whose greed, cronyism, and ineptitude caused them to run, all of us, into this current mess that we're in. We've never really dug our way out of it for sure. David's articles were published in the Hudson Valley Business Journal, the Valley City Times Record in North Dakota, and the Daily Herald in Tennessee. David is dedicated to regularly criticizing the daily news, not just the content, but the uncritical, unthinking nature of almost all of the reporting folks. He now writes his own blog, the Great Recession blog, to break down the same news from the point of view of an equal opportunity critic toward both Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals. And I should mention before we say hello to David that you should go to the greatrecession.info blog, the greatrecession.info blog. That is really, the greatrecession.info is the website, and there you'll read David's blog, which is really writes a lot of really interesting stuff, which is why we're really happy to say hello. Thanks for joining me today, David.
Well, thanks for inviting me, Jay.
Really interesting. I guess it was one of your articles that caught my eye, and it probably was the one we want to focus on today. And that was your article really predicting what you saw coming in 2016. You're writing a lot about what can only be considered doom and gloom, I guess. But the title of my show is Turning Hard Times into Good Times, so I'm hoping that you'll have a vision of some kind of good times in the future for folks who are prepared for the difficulties that you very rationally predict. So my question is, do you see the possibility of a happy and good life in the future for those who are ready to face what you refer to as the epocalypse? And if so, what will, quote, a good life, end quote, in the not-too-distant future, what will it look like in America?
Well, I think one of the things that's kind of funny about me writing about doom and gloom, and maybe it's one of the reasons I can write about it, is I tend to take everything with a sense of humor, and so I don't get really depressed about these things, and I sometimes have to be a little careful talking about them with others who maybe don't share that outlook on life, and they get a little bit more easily upset by them.
Yes.
I have a lot of faith going forward in life, and I think, no matter what comes and what I have to brave, it's all an interesting learning experience. Life is rich even in its hardships, and I think we're going into a time of a great deal of hardship. I've been through times of personal hardship myself, and I know that I can learn a lot through them, and I grow a lot through them, and that I can find good times in them. I can laugh during hard times most of the time. And this might be one of those times that's going to test, I'm sure it will be one of those times that's going to test those skills for me.
Sure.
I think that there's always possibility of something that's, good that's going to come out of the worst of times. I think we're going into a time where our problems are so great and we push them ahead that it's going to take a monumental kind of solution. And the question I would have is, do we have the political will to do it and the political unity of vision to do it? I think with the amount of debt that we're seeing that nations have stacked up, that first we're seeing the little nations fall, the Brazils, the Greeces, the Italys struggling and having problems, but it spreads with contagion beyond that. That if we're going to move to a good time, we're going to have a debt jubilee. To me, that's the answer, is a global reboot where and the only way it would work is if it was fair. You just say, what, all debts are washed away. We're just hitting the major reboot button here because we've piled up so much that we could spend the next 100 years trying to dig ourselves out of it and, being indebted to large bankers and governments being indebted to government, and we can all struggle along, or we could just agree to just reboot and start over. And each person walks away with the hard assets that they have already in their possession, but their debts are forgiven. That's going to be a hardship of its own, because if you got retirement accounts, well, you probably lost a lot of it, because probably it's built on bonds and other things that also get forgiven in that process. But I think it would be refreshing. I'd love to see it happen, but it would take a different set of politicians. It would take people divorcing themselves from their party affiliations, because obviously neither party is putting forward an answer that looks anything like that. Take a lot of strength.
Yeah, it certainly would. I mean, and it just doesn't seem to be in the nature of people to be willing to say, okay, I'll forgive these debts. And, I mean, the whole system is so built on debt. I mean, before we went off the gold standard, of course, when there was still most of the globe until 1971, at least throughout history, has had some semblance of asset-backed money, asset-based money, I should say, that sort of kept things from getting so levered as they are now. Would you agree?
I would, and I think our only solution would be that we have to get completely out of the mindset of building things based on debt. Debt has its place, but the reason it's going to be hard to come to a solution is our whole economic model is built on it. That's how the Federal Reserve creates money, is through loans. It creates money in its reserve banks, and those go out and they make loans and they get the money into circulation. That way, if people don't take the loan, they don't really have a means of getting new money into the system.
Yeah, because real capital, real money, real capital would come from savings, from honest savings, as opposed to money that's created out of thin air and pumped into the system. I mean, we saw it in a massive amount, a massive quantity after, with quantitative easing after 2008, 2009, where you had new quote-unquote capital created out of nothing that all of a sudden comes into the system and competes with honest capital, that is savings from past production, right? And now, how can and so you have this huge leverage system that makes it ever more difficult to unwind it, right?
Well, it does, and it's the big players that are playing and making advantage of that, and so in the process, we see this hugely widening gap between rich and poor, haves and have-nots, between the 1% and the 99%, because it's those people with the big money to put in the stock market that are able to participate in that system. But the savers who would just like to save their money and try to get ahead a little bit, those guys are shut out. They can't make any money on their money, and now in a number of countries they're losing money on their money. Negative interest rates.
Yeah, so exactly, and they're talking about it here too, David.
Yeah, they're talking about it here, and then Japan just did it.
Yeah. Well, so what I wanted to talk to you about were some of the mega trends that you see for 2016. First of all, I'd like to ask you an interesting word creation that I think you've made this word. I haven't seen it anywhere else, and I couldn't find it in the dictionary, but epocalypse. Epocalypse instead of apocalypse. So an epoch, I guess it comes from the word epoch, or a major change in history, I guess, right?
Yeah, I was looking for a word that would be big enough and, that might start to be used so we can talk about this, because sometimes it helps us to have a handle on something.
Sure.
It needed to be a really big word, and I came up with a variety of different ideas and didn't like them or found them already used. And I found that this word had been used actually some time ago, back in the Y2K bug days, to talk about the idea of an electronic apocalypse, but it never really gained any ground. So I thought, well, I'm going to recoin it and use it for what I'm talking about, which is an economic apocalypse. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of things about the word that I liked. The word apocalypse itself actually means revelation. Mm-hmm. But we commonly think of it as meaning the types of really massive events that are spoken of in the book of Revelation, right?
Yes.
So, things that happen on a biblical scale. And I see what we're going into is that kind of a massive transformation period, something that's very big, mm-hmm. Like these Holocaust types of events. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I wanted a word that's that big. You've got the idea of something that's epic in scale in the word apocalypse. There's kind of the sound of collapse in apocalypse. Yeah. And it's all of those things.
Well, yeah, it's a very interesting word creation that I think fits what you're talking about, and unfortunately, although I think if you learn to deal with it, as you say, or you become aware of this reality, then you can prepare for it as best as possible. to the extent possible, physically by protecting yourself or living in an area where you can be safer, or I would also say spiritually and emotionally protect yourself for the difficulties that are to come. But let's talk a little bit about your article that you wrote about 2016. You see megatrends, and I'd like to talk to you about some of those megatrends. You mentioned Brazil and Greece, some of the smaller countries. I don't think Brazil is so small, but it certainly had its ups when it was selling a lot of stuff to China, but more recently, of course, with the Chinese shutting down their imports of all manner of materials, Brazil has fallen on hard times. But other countries that have prospered and are really friendly to the United States, like Japan, Canada, Australia, they're having their troubles too now, aren't they? They're starting to have their troubles as a result of this debt unwinding of debt.
Yeah, they are, and I mentioned in my article, I said that there was that basically we're already in a global recession. Now, if you make these economies, these different countries' economies in their own currency, there's only a few of them that are in recession. Of course, that's the way you would normally measure it. If you measure their economies in dollars, well, most of the world is now into recession, and a large part of that, of course, is because of the exchange rate of dollars.
Yeah.
In order to save themselves, these countries, numerous ones, have suppressed the value of their currency. Japan, China, Europe, and way down below what the dollar is. But I don't think it's an unfair comparison to say, well, let's measure these economies in dollars and see what we've got as a global recession, because what do they owe their debt in?
Yes.
So them owe their debt in dollars. That's what they're going to have to pay it back. And we often talk about, well, how do we measure how big their debt problems are? Well, we compare it to their GDP. Well, if we look at their GDP in dollars, it's shrunk hugely. And, all of a sudden, their GDP looks nowhere near being able to pay off the kinds of debts they've got. So, we've got nations that can't conceivably pay their debts anymore.
Yeah, well, that's for sure, and I would suppose that might even be true of the United States, but that's another issue. Right. Okay, so then there's countries like Venezuela, Russia, Ukraine. You mentioned Greece already. We know the story of Greece to an extent, but comment on those countries. I mean, they're all unique situations. Maybe Russia and Ukraine are more tied together, but Venezuela, it seems like, I heard the other day, they have very low pumping costs. They can still produce, I think Dennis Gartman was talking about producing oil fairly cheaply yet, so Venezuela is likely to continue pumping oil, but oil seems to be a big part of the story here, right?
Yeah, I just read today, this was the first I had heard it, that Venezuela's cost of pumping oil may be as low as $17 a barrel.
Yeah.
And Saudi Arabia's costs may be as low as $5 a barrel.
Right.
And likewise with Iran's, which might be even lower still. So these guys, Venezuela, an oil-based economy, Russia, an oil-based economy in a lot of ways, they desperately need that oil money. And if they can keep pumping it at any kind of cash flow at all, they can't afford to turn it down even a little bit because they're really hurting. So I think it plays a lot into the oil thing. Mm-hmm.
So they have to just keep pumping for cash flow so they can pay their debts and keep their societies together, I guess, in part.
Yeah, one of the moves that I saw recently, just last week, was the stock market went up because oil prices went up a little bit. And I've been writing an article about this called Irrational Exuberance, and the stock market knows no bounds. I thought, this is nuts. The oil price went up a little bit because they said, well, Russia is willing to talk with
Saudi Arabia, maybe?
Saudi Arabia, yeah. About the prices of oil and consider cutting back. But they can't cut back. Russia's got oil running through pipes in Siberia that if they don't keep the oil moving, it's going to gel up inside the pipes. So they got some movement going, and they got to have all the cash flow that they can. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, of course they're going to talk about it, but it was crazy that both the price of oil momentarily went up on speculation and that the stock market took this big leap up for a day. Mm-hmm. I didn't think it was going to last, and it didn't. It's going right back down again. Mm-hmm. But to me, it's irrational because the forces that these countries are up against in terms of the need for their oil, that's just one of the small contributors with the oil thing. But certainly the fact that their economies are in recession is a part of it.
Yeah, no question about it. And you would think that, but I want to ask you about Russia and China in a little bit. But we keep hearing from the happy talkers on the mainstream media that the United States, is in pretty good shape, and we can pull everybody else out, perhaps, or at least, we're at least there's good reason for everybody to keep confident in the United States because, well, we're pretty good, we're pretty well off. What are your thoughts about the U.S. economy right now?
Well, we've got our own mountain of debt, and we might be the last one, we'll be the last one pulled down into the problems that these other countries are having. But if they're all hurting that much, they're not going to be able to buy as much in the way of U.S. exports. And I know people say, well, exporting isn't that big of a part of our economy, but it's still a big enough part to matter. We're running out of trading partners. We're, facing places like Puerto Rico that can't pay their debts, mostly owed to, the United States and the people in the United States. So, it's gonna bring problems for the U.S. I don't think we've got the muscle to pull people out.
So if there's no engine, I mean, after the 2008-2009, China went to work. They started printing money. I don't know if they went to work. They started printing money and building cities that are unoccupied and bridges to nowhere and so on and so forth. And now they've got excess capacity and they've got all kinds of issues and they can't buy anymore. It seems to me that we've run out of countries to bail us out, and if the U.S. can't do it. So I guess I don't know if you're familiar with John Exter's inverted pyramid, but it seems to me that the whole globe is now in that situation where the debt has reached sort of maximum debt, and it can't go any further, and now we have to unwind. Is that the way you see it?
Yeah, I think that's what we're clawing against. A lot of us, have been saying for years that the debt that we're building up is getting to that kind of a point. And I guess this is what it looks like when it gets there.
Yeah, it seems to be the case. Well, let's talk a little bit about oil, some more about oil. I mean, it seems to me, you mentioned a guy named Tom Clausa, and he was just about as spot on as anybody there was. He was predicting that oil would go to $30 last year, and I'm looking today, I think it's down, I don't know, it's below 30, 28 or something and change perhaps today. What is this gentleman saying now?
Well, I was just reading him today, and I thought it was kind of interesting because his comments today were picking up on the same thing that I thought was so significant. I mentioned a moment ago how the market spiked up because Russia and Saudi Arabia were talking about whether or not they'd make a cutback in oil, and he said nothing happened today. This was a non-event, and yet you've got the market jumping up, and it's not rational. He says, of course they're going to say that they're going to talk. What else are they going to say? No, we won't. But talk is cheap, right? Anybody can do that. It doesn't change the fact that they've got these big pressures that are pushing on them. You got to think about why the Saudis are in this game. Mm-hmm. OPEC, for a long time, pretty much controlled the price of oil, and what that really meant was if oil prices go down, it was because OPEC would reduce supply. Nobody else necessarily reduced what they were producing, but OPEC, being by far the biggest producers, would make the change. But the United States at that time was, an oil importing nation, a net import, and we're not exporting oil like we are now. Well, now as we're exporting more and more, Saudi Arabia and others in OPEC look at that equation and say, well, hold it, you want the price to go down, but you want all the cuts to be made on the side of our production. We're not going to do it. So, until you make the cuts in your production too, at least, if you want us to cut back 500,000 barrels a day, you cut back 500,000 barrels a day.
Yeah.
We're not used to that. We're used to, we can just produce what we want because they're making so much they can make all the cuts.
So it sort of boils down to nations doing what they feel is in their own best interest. And why would they be altruistic, I guess, right? Why would they bend over for our benefit? And isn't this sort of what's really happening globally now, especially, Russia and China are saying, no, you guys have pushed your empire far enough. We're not willing to be taken over by you guys. Stay out of the South Sea, America. These are our islands. You have no business being here. And Russia and China now are trading more from what I read, they're doing some oil trade in oil with gold. Russia's selling its oil to China for gold, and they certainly are not trading in petrodollars anymore. To me, it seems like we're at a point where a lot of this has to do with geopolitics and the ability of the Anglo-American Empire and NATO to survive. It needs to continue to expand. And do you see it that way? Do you think there's some of that going on as part of what this is all about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and every player's got its own political thing that it's interested in, right?
Right.
You ask, why would Russia and China do something altruistic? They wouldn't, but they couldn't do something to hurt the United States either at one point because they were heavily invested in petrodollars. They were heavily invested in the U.S. So if you hurt the United States in a significant material way, your own investments are going to shrink up. So what we saw, 3 years ago, I started writing, well, it looks to me like China and Russia are divesting from U.S. dollars. That
yes.
They're buying lots of gold. And at the time, not too many people were pointing this out, but I was like, look, I think this is where the gold is being purchased. I think it's being purchased by China. Maybe a half a year later, it started coming out that it was being purchased by China. Mm-hmm. And I think they're doing that to back out of U.S. treasuries because until they get out, they can't do anything that's going to hurt the U.S. It's not altruism that keeps them from doing it. It's their own financial interest. But Russia has, I believe, pretty well divested from U.S. treasuries now, and China has in the last year taken some pretty large steps in that direction. So it becomes easier for them to not care what damage they do to us.
Yeah. Well, it certainly seems that way to me, and I'm glad to hear you say that because that's my read of things. And I just think that maybe part of the reason that the economies are weak in the West is because a lot of that trade is no longer being enacted or transacted with the West. It's going between, China and Russia, and they've set up their own financial systems, their own trading systems, their own, electronic money moving systems and so forth, and their own infrastructure, their own banks, because the West hasn't been willing to play fair with them, so they're doing their own thing. We're just about out of time here. I want to tell our listeners that they should really definitely go to your blog and read what you have to say. This particular article that I'm touching on here, and just basically, David's just very basically talking about there are a whole bunch of megatrends. The industrial recession in the U.S., stocks in bondage, the big bond bust. I mean, hedgehogs heading for the hills. That's very interesting how the people are putting their money into hedge funds, and the hedge funds are they don't know what to do with the money. The stuff going on in the Middle East, there's just a whole host of stuff that people should really go to and to David's blog and read about the Great Recession.info. TheGreatRecession.info is the place to go to. David, we are out of time. I want to thank you so much for being with us. I look forward to following your work and talking to you again sometime in the near future. You have so many things to talk about that I think are spot on. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks, Jay. I really enjoyed it.